Firstly, thank you, AAT, Shamila, Nalin, President, for inviting me. Past presidents of AAT, distinguished members of the private sector, ladies and gentlemen. During the introduction, Shamila mentioned, how do we as a nation come out of this? And the theme of your conference in that context is quite apt: revival, survival, and gaining edge. But as Supun mentioned, I think survival comes first. In the face of the worst economic crisis in living memory for a few generations at least that we have ever experienced, where our standard of living in terms of GDP per capita will go back 10 years, wiping out virtually all of the gains of the post-conflict era. There'll be a drastic drop in living standards. Now, notwithstanding the doom and gloom, I'm a believer in Winston Churchill's famous quote, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." However, I'm yet to be convinced whether we as a nation are equipped with the depth of leadership, both at the political and the bureaucratic level, in order to make good of this crisis. I will explain this matter later. And as I was preparing for this address, the thought occurred to me that the answer to the central theme of this conference is embedded in the three letters of your professional body, AAT. And in my view, the key attributes you as an individual or a CEO or a manager of an organization or even a country or an entrepreneur needs to do to survive, revive, and gain the edge is contained in A, which is anticipate, the second A, adapt, and T, transform. Let me explain. Anticipate. And what I mean by anticipation is taking a realistic view of the current economic situation and your own personal situation and that of the businesses you run in the context of the country's current socio-political environment. Now, that is what I did running my small little investment bank in 2020, where I had a bunch of smart people. And we anticipated this crisis 2 years before we went bankrupt. And through a deep reflection of what my own personal strengths were and my own skill competencies, we did a pivot. In fact, my business, we tripled in size in terms of the number of people at a time where my own personal income went down 75%. There were no dividends from the tourism industry. My consulting income dropped. And then I thought, what was my edge? And then the thought dawned on me that over a period of 26 years, I'm probably the only person, leaving aside India, that has financially closed $2.3 billion of public-private partnership projects in this country and in Nepal. I'm talking financially closed, which means implemented. So then our business pivoted, and today, 80% of our income is from overseas. We advise foreign governments, and we export our expertise in PPPs. Therefore, your ability to anticipate through your own research and personal reflection is a key tool for surviving, reviving, and gaining the edge. Now, during 20 and 21, before the bankruptcy, we witnessed the government's failure and inability to anticipate. We failed to anticipate the reduction in deposits. We got carried away with somewhere in May or June 2020, remittances went up to $700 million. Oh, everybody said, fantastic. But did anyone inform the political authorities at the time that that 700 million that month or the next month came because there were layoffs of hundreds of thousands of Sri Lankans and they were bringing back their termination benefits? So there was going to be a fundamental shift downward of remittances. And of course, that accelerated with the misguided policy of pegging the interest exchange rate at 200. We failed to anticipate the impact of declining tourism and FDI. We failed to anticipate that the international community would not help us. For example, We did not expect the IMF to say, no, we are not giving you the rapid financing investment of $10 million. Why? Because our debt, we were told in April 2020 that our debt was unsustainable, and we didn't get the $800 billion. We anticipated help from the Middle East. We did not have a chance, and we knew that in 2020 because of the policy of the Muslim burials that were implemented in our country and the nonsensical behavior of Buddhist priests such as Jnanasara. We did not anticipate the fact that we would not receive assistance from China and Japan, though the newspapers were touting this. Why? Because we had mishandled our country's relationship with China and Japan. And finally, India came to help us, and we only managed to extend our debt by a few months because of the largest extended to us by our neighbors to the north. However, high-ranking officials fed us with false data and false hope, including the politicians, false forecasts that $10 billion was going to come into our reserves by end of 2021. Now, in the current scenario, you need to realistically anticipate the first A of the impact, as mentioned earlier, of high inflation and high interest rates, the global slowdown as a consequence of a potential recession in the West, forex shortages, our isolation from the international financial markets and its impact on the banks, the slow revival of tourism. Our image is very negative in the key markets. Power shortages. I don't know how many of you know that we have failed to significantly add to power capacity for 8 years. It is not a problem so much as lack of diesel or coal. We don't have enough capacity. So, of course, I was a member of the Power Sector Reform Committee, and we have recommended certain changes. And then finally, the lack of confidence and credibility that we have in the international community, because our reforms are progressing too slow. So once you make a realistic assessment and anticipate what do you do next, you adapt. To me, adaptability as an individual or a business or a country in the face of unprecedented odds is the key to success. Now, let us as individuals see how we can adapt. Now, some of you are adapting with your feet. You're running away from Sri Lanka and going to greener pastures. I'm not blaming anyone for doing that. I too contemplated leaving Sri Lanka during the time 89-90 when there was an insurrection in the north, insurrection in the south. I got my Canadian PR. I chose not to go to Canada and became a co-founder of a very successful investment bank where I invested 100,000 rupees and 4 years later sold it for 33 million rupees. So I made a choice. Some are, in order to remain in Sri Lanka, are converting their salaries into dollars. But not all companies can do this. Certain software companies are doing so. And I believe that there is no better way to adapt than to undertake a serious evaluation of each one's skills. There are plenty of self-learning tools today, thanks to the internet. Evaluating your own employer. How equipped is your employer to deal with the current crisis? And if you feel so, move on, move away. And making sure that your competitive advantages are known to others. Learn to communicate. There are multiple tools today available for your communication. And then when it comes to adapting your business, Dialogue explained how they adapted their business during times of crisis by being able to anticipate. Another example, I'm only citing the larger ones. I'm sure there are smaller ones also present. Expo Lanka went from a low margin freight forwarding business, brought in a Japanese company as a joint venture partner, obtained the lines of credit to control the export freight market. Companies like Windforce, MAS have all adapted. Also, my company, we represented as a client a company called ESR, based out of Hong Kong, founded by a Hong Kong-based person who worked in Sri Lanka. They anticipated the growth in online commerce and quadrupled the number of warehouses that they built, raising $2-3 billion during time of COVID to build warehousing space. They wanted to come to Sri Lanka, invest $100 million, but consequent to us going bankrupt, they went away. Now, Once you adapt, you need to achieve a permanent state. And that permanent state is your transformation. You go from, like in the case of the electricity sector, what we recommended was at some point in the future, we abolish the 1969 CB Act and implement a new act. So you go into a permanent state of transformation, which is the final T in my AAT. And what does transformation mean? According to the dictionary, a complete change in appearance or character of something or someone so that that thing or that person is improved. Now, if you look at our country's history, there were two periods that Sri Lanka went through transformation, and it is through analyzing these two periods that I'll provide some solutions. Now, these two periods of transformation that I can remember in my much younger years of 1977 to 1982, where Sri Lanka opened its economy and went from a 3.5, 3.7% GDP growth rate to over 7% over a period of 3 to 4 years. Free trade zones were built. For example, Xi Jinping, the former president of China, who was then a chief minister, and Mahathir Mohamad came to Sri Lanka in 1982 to study the BOI's free trade zones. And they took our ideas and created special economic zones in their respective countries. Then the next period of transformation that I've seen in Sri Lanka was the 96 to 2000 period, when I had the privilege of being chairman of the BOI and being part of a team where we laid the foundation for growth of the telecommunication and the software sector. We privatized telecom. We brought in competition through Lanka Bell and Suntel. We made all compute and telecommunication equipment duty-free. And the list goes on. We built software parks. And then we brought in competitiveness in the Port of Colombo. Ship waiting time reduced 85% when I played a role in negotiating the SAGT project in the Port of Colombo. Now, at that time, the GDP growth rate between 96 and 2000 was 5.5%. Exports were 33% of GDP. Today, it's 15%. And we pioneered PPPs and undertook 12 or more privatizations with no one going on strike. Now, looking at these two transformation periods, I noticed 4 things in common, which I'm hoping that the government of the day would implement. What allowed us to transform during these periods? Number one, a strong and decisive bureaucracy working together with respected private sector persons implementing transformative reforms. The public sector and private sector working hand in glove. Number two, the president, the prime minister, finance minister, and key members of the cabinet had no conflicts amongst themselves on economic policy. They were all aligned. Number three, consistent communication to all stakeholders, trade unions, to the international community. Number four, reliance on institutional capacity and competent people within those institutions rather than ad hoc committees, units, or individuals. And these institutions, not individuals, would implement the reforms. So these, to me, are the 4 necessary conditions for the final of the AAT, the transformation, which is also quite important. Now, in the 77 to 82 period, Mr. Vataval will remember this as well, we had the likes of the former partner, president partner of KPMG, NGP Panditaratna, who was an uncle of mine, who worked together with Upali Vijayabodhana and a few other private sector people with the bureaucracy of the time, and brought forward probably the most progressive legislation you could imagine in the whole of Asia. The 78 BOI law, the UDA law, the Mahavali Authority Act, brilliant pieces of legislation, far ahead of its time. Then if you take the 96 to 2000 period, I was privileged to be on the founder board members of the Public Enterprise Reform Commission that privatized various companies. I had the privilege of setting up a unit within the BOI to do PPPs under the leadership of the then Secretary of the Treasury and Dr. Lal Jayabodhana, the economic advisor to the president. Now, we had at that time a president who empowered the bureaucracy. I'll give you one more example. I went to the former president 6 months after assuming the role of chairman BOI. I said, Madam, I cannot work with this board. I said, why? I said, I have a confused economist, a failed industrialist. I need the BOI to become a policy-making body. So she asked me, Thilan, whom do you want? I said, give me the Secretary to the Treasury, give me the Secretary Industries, give me the Secretary Public Policy. I selected three of the best secretaries that were there at the time, and give me Mr. Michael Mack, Chairman of Aitken Spence. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, I must have been 35 or 36 years of age at that time. Without hesitating, without batting an eyelid, she called the secretary to her room, dictate a letter, instruct the current BOI board to resign, and appoint the members that were recommended by Thilan Wijesinghe. That's the level of empowerment that the bureaucracy was given, the institution was given, not committees, not ad hoc individuals, not super bureaucrats, in order to implement the reforms. Now, the 96 to 2000 period witnessed the highest ever level of net foreign investment as a percentage of GDP, 2.8%. It's now less than 0.5%. Now, ladies and gentlemen, every month or so you read information about hundreds of millions of dollars of FDI coming into this country. Take it from me, more than 80% or probably 90% of that is existing companies like Dialog reinvesting their retained earnings in the country, not dollars coming into the country. I have seen central bank statistics. So if you want to know the truth about FDI, read the central bank annual report, where $2 billion of FDI is reported, for example, say 1.5 billion, of which 85% is rupees reinvested by foreign-owned companies. And yes, that includes John Keel's as well, because 51 point whatever percentage of John Keel's is owned by foreign portfolio investors. So when I look back to the second period I served as a public servant on an honorary basis, 2017 to 19, where I set up what was then called the National Agency for Public-Private Partnership, these necessary conditions were not there. The government was divided. We had a 52-day period. We had a weaker bureaucracy. Now, when it comes to the importance of consistent and creative communication, we privatized telecom because the then Minister Mangala Samarivira wrote letters to the wives of the trade union leaders saying, make sure your husbands don't strike. Here's the reason why we are privatizing. That's being creative. We did not have social media at the time. When there was resistance from the level of the minister downwards to the trade unions to privatize part of the port, when we did the SAGT deal, we did that through very simple analysis. I always believe in the power of analysis, where we showed the benefits of a PPP versus taking a loan from the Japanese government. Then we addressed the question 25 years ago, why profit-making enterprises should be privatized. Why are we still debating this issue? When you privatize foreign profit-making enterprises, you use that money to retire debt. That's what we did when we sold Sri Lanka Telecom. That particular year, in 1999, we achieved 6.2% GDP growth. So we are still debating these issues. Now, today, unfortunately, we are faced with inconsistent communication and messages. Certain chairmen of corporations are saying, oh, we make profits. Why should we be privatized? Ministers are making statements, oh, we must keep the port because we want to listen to the trade unions. Now, unfortunately, you as young people, the young people who are present here, are also misguided by probably one of the weakest business journalism standards I have seen anywhere in the world prevails in Sri Lanka. I must say, Financial Times could be an exception, Echelon magazine could be an exception. So you read nonsense of the sort of an investment of $1 billion coming into the Lotus Tower. Crazy. It was an MOU signed for $1.4 million of lease income. Often journalists confuse between $10 million to $1 billion. And then you find that the press are constantly parroting what the government releases. There is not enough critical analysis. The final point, the reliance on institutions and teams within that institution. When Mr. S. Jawardhan asked me to take over the PPPs, it was functioning as a unit within the finance ministry and had failed to achieve any transactions being closed. So I hired, all of us were in our 20s and 30s, a team from the private sector who worked with government sector officials to run what was then called the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment. Yes, I had protests. I created that sense of competition between the bureaucracy and the young team that came on board, and the traditional bureaucracy one day at a meeting raised their hands. Mr. Wijesinghe, we are very upset with you. You have brought in somebody in their 20s who's making 80,000 rupees a month. I'm talking 96 money. My salary is only 35,000. So then I told that particular Deputy Director General of the BOI, Mr. So-and-so, you're very welcome to resign from your position and earn the 80,000 rupees, but the conditions are those who are earning 80,000 rupees are coming on contract basis. I have the right, based on their performance, to terminate them, giving 1 month's notice. Now, I told the BOI staff, all of you raise your hands if you're willing to come on contract basis at triple your salary. Guess how many people raised their hands? 0. So, let me also explain to you the importance of institutions. The Indo-Lanka Free Trade Agreement. It was blocked initially by several individuals in the treasury, saying, no, this was going to be unfavorable to the country. That was the view of certain individuals, not the finance ministry. Then when the president asked me, I said, madam, why don't you ask the central bank, the research department of the central bank, to make an assessment whether the Indo-Lanka FTA was favorable to us or not? Rely on the institution. He said, Thilan, can you please draft me a letter and give it to me? I said, madam, I have already drafted the letter. I gave it to her. She signed it then and there. Research department came and gave a presentation. The president looked at the two individuals who said no to it. Look, this is what the central bank is saying. We signed the FTA. What happened immediately afterwards? 2000 to 2005, exports to India under the preferential tariff items went up by tenfold. Okay, let's look at the present situation. If you take these 4 factors, only some of these necessary conditions are present at the moment. And therefore, in my view, if these 4 factors are not addressed, Sri Lanka will continue to grow at suboptimal levels and there will be unsatisfactory results. Even though our president has, in his budget speech and elsewhere, said that he wants to have a transformative economy. But do we have those 4 factors that I mentioned earlier to have a transformative economy? For example, if you are to strengthen institutional capacity, we need to bring back the laws, bring back laws such as the PERC law or something similar to this. We need to legislate public-private partnership law. Bangladesh has it. Why can't we have it? The BOI law and the Port City law needs to be refined and updated. Laws to ensure the independence of the central bank. We need to introduce LLP legislation, limited liability partnership legislation. We are in crisis. We need to attract private equity, but the tax structure is unfavorable. I've been talking for 10 years about the importance of LLP legislation. Nothing. In May 2020, I spoke about the importance of a troubled assets restructuring unit, or what we call a bad bank. Yesterday, I saw Mr. Dinesh Virakode writing about the justification of a bad bank. We've been talking about it for 24 months. Certain legislative improvements are required, and some of the bankers who are present, such as Sujiva, might endorse that the fact that we need to look at what should happen, for example, to our troubled assets, such as tourism, allow fresh capital to come in, whether it's local or foreign. Now, when I say this, I'm accused by the Tourist Hotel Owners Association saying, Thilan Wijesinghe is trying to bring foreigners to buy our assets. No, I'm trying to bring fresh capital so that assets can be recycled. That's what happens during times of crisis. Certain individuals, certain businesses fail, new businesses, new capital comes into the country, those assets are revived, and we as a country progress. We need stronger laws on corruption, stronger laws on digitization. I can tell you responsibly, most of the big tenders for computerization IT are fixed in this country. And that's why we have suboptimum results in the revenue generating agencies such as Inland Revenue, Customs and Excise. We need to transform the bureaucracy. The balance of power has to shift from the political authorities to the bureaucracy led by the central bank, Ministry of Finance, and a revamped National Planning Department. We need to change the laws to bring back the system of permanent secretaries that prevailed prior to 1972. So you have at the moment a political class where more than 75% or 80% do not have their A-levels or even a degree, who are running roughshod over a bureaucracy where 100% of them have a university degree. Meritocracy must be brought back to the public service and competition, like what I did at the BII. And therefore, bringing competition means that secretarial positions could potentially be filled by private sector individuals who are, yes, earning higher salaries. I believe secretary salaries should be quadruple, because if you look at the current situation, in the private sector, the salary differential between the lowest paid to the highest paid is about 1:100. In a line ministry, the salary differential between the secretary and the lowest paid is 1:3 or 1:4. If you take a typical line ministry secretary, the salary differential between a private sector individual is 1:20. So without administrative reforms and without bringing back the dignity of public service, they are not servants of the politicians. Without bringing back the dignity in the public service, I'm sorry, there cannot be a system change. I personally believe that institutions like national planning and the Ministry of Plan Implementation, which had a very important role to play in the post-77 reforms, should be brought into a legislated body. I'm not advocating the creation of new institutions. We have enough government establishments. We can use the same staff in the Finance Ministry, National Planning, and bring the creme de la creme of the current public sector, and there are very competent public sector officials, into a transformative institution that is legislated. For example, in Malaysia, we had what was called Pemandu. Today, Pemandu is not-for-profit, and it's exporting their services. And it was Pemandu who initiated the transformation of the Malaysian economy. In India, we have what is called a National Institute of Transformative India, NITI. That is a policy-making body set up by an act of parliament. So I'd like to conclude this because I think I'm going over my time. Now, finally, my message to young professionals and students: even if we as a country fail to transform, remember, it's very easy for you, AAT as your tool for survival and revival. Anticipate, adapt, and transform. Your transformation, as I mentioned earlier, can be done through deep reflection of your own strengths. Do a SWOT analysis for your own self. For example, then, if you do that, you might quit your job, which is paying you Lankan rupees, which will probably be worth 50% of what it is 1 or 2 years down the road. And you might go farm and export crop. If you have a passion for agriculture, do it. I know people who have done it. If you're staying back in this country, then grab the jobs of those who are migrating. That's what I did in the 90s. There was really no proper investment bank at that time. And as I mentioned earlier, move to companies that you think are going to survive. Sell your business. I mentioned earlier about recycling capital. Use that money to do something else that is transformative. And remember, in every crisis, there are winners and losers, and there are opportunities. It's your ability to anticipate, adapt, and transform that will enable you to navigate through these turbulent times and grab these opportunities. Don't wait for the country to transform itself. You transform yourselves and your organization through AAT. Now, even to reform the country, there are eminent private sector professionals present here. I believe we in the private sector are too passive. That's why I keep making these controversial speeches. We do not have the 4 necessary conditions for transformation in this country yet. Let us make sure that this happens. Let us as a private sector impress on the government the importance of institutions, etc. If not, Sri Lanka will continue to be a country that is defined by what I always say, pockets of excellence within a sea of mediocrity. So the challenge to you is, without waiting for the country to reform, how can you be one of those pockets of excellence? And then, only then, when there are many of these pockets of excellence, that this sea of mediocrity can hopefully become a lake. And we as a country can see better times for us and our future generations. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.